Mike sat on a park bench, his worn clothes and weathered face blending into the urban landscape. The bustling city of New York continued its relentless pace around him, a stark contrast to his stillness. He watched as businessmen in crisp suits hurried past, their eyes glued to smartphones, while tourists snapped photos of the skyline. The scene before him was a daily reminder of the life he once had and the one he now lived. His gaze fell on a young couple sharing a coffee and laughing together. A pang of loneliness struck him, and he quickly looked away. It had been years since he'd felt that kind of connection with anyone. The streets of New York, once a playground for his ambitions, had become his home in a way he never imagined. Mike's mind drifted to the events that led him here. The economic downturn, the loss of his job, the mounting bills, and finally, the eviction notice that changed everything. He remembered the initial shock of sleeping on the subway, the gradual acceptance of park benches as beds, and the harsh reality of winter nights in shelters. As he sat there, a mail carrier approached, looking slightly confused. The carrier glanced at the letter in his hand, then at Mike, before hesitantly asking, "Are you Michael Thompson?" Surprised to hear his full name, Mike nodded. The carrier handed him the letter and quickly moved on, leaving Mike staring at the unexpected piece of mail. The return address bore a name he didn't recognize: Harold Thompson, attorney at law. With cautious curiosity, Mike tore open the envelope. As he unfolded the letter, his eyes widened in disbelief. The words inheritance and substantial estate jumped out at him. According to the letter, a grandfather he had never known had passed away, leaving him a significant fortune. Mike read and reread the letter, his mind racing. A grandfather? An inheritance? It seemed too fantastical to be true. He had always believed he had no living relatives, let alone a wealthy one. The letter provided details about a meeting to discuss the terms of the inheritance, but Mike found himself skeptical. Years on the street had taught Mike to be wary of anything that seemed too good to be true. He had seen countless scams and false promises, each one preying on the desperate hopes of those with nothing left to lose. This letter, with its promise of sudden wealth, set off alarm bells in his mind. As he contemplated the situation, the harsh realities of his daily life began to reassert themselves. The gnawing hunger in his stomach and the chill in the air reminded him of more immediate concerns. The promise of inheritance seemed like a distant dream compared to the pressing need to find his next meal and a safe place to sleep for the night. Mike folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Part of him wanted to dismiss it entirely, to chalk it up as another cruel joke played by fate. But a small voice in the back of his mind urged him to investigate further. What if it was real? What if this was the chance to change his life? As he stood up from the bench, Mike felt the weight of his current reality pulling at him. The familiar streets called to him, offering the comfort of routine and known dangers. The letter in his pocket felt like a foreign object, a glimpse into a world he no longer understood. Mike began to walk, his feet automatically taking him towards the areas he knew were safe for the night. As he moved, his mind continued to grapple with the implications of the letter. Should he pursue this potential inheritance? Or was it safer to stick to the life he knew, however harsh it might be? The bustling city continued around him, indifferent to his internal struggle. Mike realized that whatever decision he made, it would have to wait until he had secured his immediate needs. The survival instincts honed by years on the street took precedence, pushing thoughts of mysterious grandfathers and inheritances to the background. As night fell over New York, Mike found himself at a familiar shelter. The letter remained in his pocket, a silent promise, or perhaps a threat, of a life beyond the streets. Tomorrow, he thought, he would start to unravel this mystery. But for now, survival came first. The following day, Mike found himself wandering through a bustling area of the city, his mind still preoccupied with the letter. As he turned a corner, Searching for a quiet spot to reassess his situation, a woman's voice called out to him, "Mike? Michael Thompson?" He turned to see a well-dressed woman in her mid-30s approaching him. Her crisp business suit and confident stride marked her as someone from a world far removed from Mike's current circumstances. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending her hand. "I'm your cousin. I've been looking for you." Mike hesitated, taken aback by this sudden appearance of another supposed relative. Sarah seemed to sense his unease and quickly added, "I know this must be a shock. I work in marketing, and when I heard about Uncle Harold's will, I used my networking skills to track you down." Still wary, Mike nodded, but didn't speak. Sarah glanced around, taking in Mike's disheveled appearance and the curious stares from passers-by. "Why don't we go somewhere more comfortable to talk?" she suggested, gesturing towards a nearby cafe. "My treat, of course." Hunger won out over caution, and Mike found himself following Sarah into the warm, aromatic interior of the cafe. As they settled into a quiet corner booth, Sarah ordered coffee and sandwiches for both of them. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions," Sarah began, her tone businesslike yet sympathetic. "Uncle Harold, your grandfather, was quite the recluse. He had a falling out with much of the family years ago, including your father. That's why you never knew about him." Mike listened silently, his eyes darting between Sarah and the approaching waiter with their food. As the plates were set down, he couldn't help but reach for the sandwich immediately, his body responding to the sight of real, fresh food. Sarah waited until he had taken a few bites before continuing. "The inheritance is substantial, Mike. It could completely change your life. But there are some complications, legal matters that need to be sorted out. That's where I can help." Mike swallowed hard, forcing himself to slow down and consider Sarah's words. "Why would you want to help me?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We're family, Mike, and frankly, this inheritance could benefit all of us if managed correctly. I have the skills and connections to navigate the legal hurdles and make sure you get what's rightfully yours." As Sarah spoke, Mike felt a growing sense of unease. Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she had practiced this pitch. He wondered how much of her interest was genuine family concern and how much was self-interest. "I appreciate the offer," Mike said slowly, "but I need time to think about all this. It's a lot to take in." Sarah's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, I understand. Here's my card. Take all the time you need, but don't wait too long. There are time-sensitive aspects to the inheritance that we need to address." As they finished their meal, Mike thanked Sarah for the food, but declined her offer of a ride or a place to stay. He left the cafe feeling more conflicted than ever, Sarah's business card a heavy weight in his pocket alongside the attorney's letter. Making his way back to familiar streets, Mike found himself gravitating towards the spot where he often met up with Rita and Tony, two other homeless individuals he had come to consider friends. He found them huddled in their usual alcove, sharing a worn blanket against the evening chill. "Mike, where have you been, man?" Tony called out as he approached. "We were starting to worry." Rita scooted over, making room for Mike to join them. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she observed, her keen eyes taking in his troubled expression. Mike sighed, settling in beside them. "You wouldn't believe the day I've had," he began, and proceeded to tell them about the letter and his encounter with Sarah. As he recounted the events, Rita and Tony listened with a mixture of excitement and concern. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before Tony spoke up. "Sounds too good to be true if you ask me," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen plenty of folks get taken for a ride with promises like that." Rita nodded in agreement but added, "Still, what if it is real? This could be your chance, Mike, a way out of all this." She gestured around at their meager surroundings. Mike pulled out Sarah's card, turning it over in his hands. "I don't know who to trust," he admitted. "Sarah seems nice enough, but something feels off. And this whole idea of suddenly having money, it doesn't feel real. Take it slow, Rita advised. Don't sign anything or agree to anything until you're sure. We've got your back, whatever you decide. As the night deepened around them, Mike felt a conflicting mix of hope and fear. The possibility of a new life tantalized him, but the street-honed instinct for self-preservation warned him to be cautious. He tucked Sarah's card away with the letter, knowing that tomorrow would bring new decisions and challenges. For now, surrounded by the only people he truly trusted, Mike allowed himself to relax slightly. Whatever came next, he knew he wasn't entirely alone. The inheritance might promise wealth, but here, in this simple moment of companionship, Mike felt a different kind of richness, one that money couldn't buy. The following day, as Mike navigated the busy streets, a new figure entered his increasingly complicated life. A lanky man with paint-splattered jeans and an eccentric air approached him, his eyes alight with curiosity. "Mike? I'm David, your uncle," the man said, extending a hand adorned with colorful rings. "I'm an artist. I heard about the inheritance and wanted to meet you." Mike, still reeling from his encounter with Sarah, eyed David warily. "Another relative?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. David nodded, seemingly unfazed by Mike's cautious demeanor. "I know it's a lot to take in. Our family, well, it's complicated. But I'm not here about the money. I want to talk about art, about freedom." Intrigued despite himself, Mike allowed David to lead him to a nearby park. They sat on a bench, the cityscape a stark contrast to David's bohemian appearance. "You see, Mike," David began, gesturing broadly, "money can trap you. But art sets you free. It's about expression, about finding your voice in this chaotic world." As David spoke passionately about his sculptures and paintings, Mike found himself drawn in by the man's enthusiasm. There was something appealing about the idea of creative freedom, especially to someone who had been constrained by survival for so long. "I've always admired street art," Mike admitted, thinking of the vibrant murals that brought life to even the grimmest corners of the city. David's eyes lit up. "Exactly. That's real art, man. No galleries, no pretension, just pure expression." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Look, I know Sarah's probably given you the hard sell about managing the inheritance, but money's just a tool. What matters is what you do with it." As their conversation continued, Mike began to sense that David, like Sarah, had his own agenda. While the artist spoke of freedom and creativity, there were moments when his eyes gleamed with the same interest Mike had seen in Sarah's, the look of someone who saw opportunity in this unexpected windfall. As the day wore on, David eventually took his leave, pressing a business card into Mike's hand, much like Sarah had done. "Think about what I said," David urged. "Art can change the world, Mike. And with resources, imagine what you could create." Left alone once more, Mike found his thoughts in turmoil. The pragmatic part of him, honed by years on the street, warned him to be cautious of these sudden family members and their grand ideas. Yet another part, long dormant, stirred with the possibility of a life beyond mere survival. As evening approached, Mike made his way back to the spot where he usually met Rita and Tony. He found them setting up a makeshift camp for the night, their faces lighting up as they saw him approach. "There he is, the man of mystery," Tony called out, a grin spreading across his weathered face. "Any more long-lost relatives show up today?" Mike couldn't help but chuckle as he settled down beside them. "As a matter of fact, yes," he replied, and proceeded to recount his encounter with David. Rita listened intently, her brow furrowed in concern. "First a marketing expert, now an artist," she mused. "Seems like everyone's got an idea about what you should do with this inheritance." Tony nodded in agreement. "You gotta be careful, Mike. People see money, and suddenly they're your best friend. Even family can turn on you when there's cash involved. As they shared a meager dinner of canned goods and day-old bread, Mike found himself opening up about his conflicted feelings. "Part of me wants to believe them," he admitted. "The idea of having a real family, of having options, it's tempting." Rita reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We may not be blood, Mike, but we're family too. Don't forget that." Tony chimed in, his voice gruff but kind. "Yeah, and unlike these newfound relatives, we liked you just fine when you didn't have a dime to your name." Their words struck a chord in Mike. As he looked at his friends, he realized that amid all the confusion and sudden changes, they were his constant. They understood him in a way that Sarah and David, with their polished pitches and grand ideas, never could. As night fell and the city's rhythms changed, Mike found himself pondering the true meaning of family and fortune. The inheritance promised a new life, but at what cost? And could any amount of money replace the bonds he'd formed on these unforgiving streets? With these thoughts swirling in his mind, Mike settled in for another night under the stars, the business cards of his newfound relatives tucked away, a reminder of the decision that loomed before him. As he drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the city mingled with the quiet breathing of Rita and Tony, a familiar lullaby that spoke of a different kind of wealth, one built on trust, shared struggles, and genuine care. The following day, Mike found himself drawn to the public library, a place he often sought refuge in during harsh weather. Today, however, his purpose was different. With the help of a sympathetic librarian, he managed to access some old newspaper archives and public records, hoping to find more information about his mysterious grandfather. As he pored over microfiche and dusty files, Mike stumbled upon something unexpected, a collection of old letters and documents that had been part of a local history project. Among them were several items that mentioned his grandfather, Harold Thompson. Mike's hands trembled slightly as he carefully unfolded one of the yellowed letters. It was a love letter, passionate and poetic, addressed to a woman named Elizabeth. The letter was signed by Harold, but the date on it was years after Harold had supposedly married Mike's grandmother. Intrigued and slightly unsettled, Mike dug deeper. He found more letters, each painting a picture of a complex man torn between duty and desire. In one particularly revealing letter, Harold wrote about a child that couldn't be acknowledged publicly due to the scandal it would cause. The implications hit Mike like a thunderbolt. Could he have an aunt or uncle he never knew about? A cousin, perhaps, who was unaware of their connection to the Thompson family? As Mike continued his research, he uncovered more details about his grandfather's life. Harold Thompson had been a successful businessman, but the documents hinted at a restless spirit, a man who felt trapped by societal expectations and his own choices. The more Mike read, the more he realized how little he truly knew about his family history. The inheritance that had seemed like a simple windfall now appeared to be tied to a complex web of secrets and unresolved relationships. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah and David were engaged in their own discussion about the inheritance. Sarah had invited David to her sleek downtown office, ostensibly to strategize about how to help Mike, but their conversation quickly revealed deeper motivations. "We need to be careful how we approach this," Sarah said, pacing behind her desk. "Mike's street smart. If we push too hard, he'll shut us out completely." David lounged in a chair, his artistic dishevelment a stark contrast to Sarah's corporate environment. "I don't see why we're tiptoeing around this," he replied. "The guy's been homeless for years. He has no idea how to manage this kind of money." Sarah shot David a sharp look. "And I suppose you think you could do better? Your last 3 galleries barely broke even." David's casual demeanor slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of anger. "At least I'm not trying to turn our family legacy into another soulless corporate venture," he snapped. Their argument escalated, each accusing the other of trying to manipulate the situation for their own benefit. It was clear that beneath their shows of family concern, both Sarah and David saw the inheritance as an opportunity, one they were reluctant to let slip through their fingers. As their heated discussion continued, neither of them aware of Mike's discoveries at the library, the true complexity of the Thompson family dynamics began to emerge. Sarah's marketing expertise and David's artistic passion were just surface-level representations of deeper divides within the family, divides that had roots going back to Harold's time. Back at the library, Mike sat back, his mind reeling from the information he'd uncovered. The inheritance, which had initially seemed like a simple matter of accepting a sum of money, now felt like opening Pandora's box. Each new piece of information raised more questions, hinting at family secrets that had been buried for decades. As closing time approached, Mike carefully gathered the documents he'd been examining. The librarian, noticing his intense focus throughout the day, approached him. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked kindly. Mike shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure," he replied. "I think I might have found more than I bargained for." Leaving the library, Mike felt the weight of his discoveries pressing down on him. The streets of New York, once simply his home and battleground for survival, now seemed to hold echoes of a family history he was only beginning to understand. As night fell, Mike found himself wandering, lost in thought. The usual worries about finding a safe place to sleep were overshadowed by the tumult of his discoveries. He had entered the library hoping for clarity, but had left with a mind full of new questions and possibilities. The business cards from Sarah and David seemed to burn in his pocket, reminders of the immediate decisions he faced. But now, with the knowledge of a potential unknown family member out there, the situation had become even more complicated. Mike realized that accepting the inheritance wouldn't just be about changing his own life anymore. It could mean unraveling decades of family secrets, potentially affecting lives he hadn't even known existed until today. As he finally made his way back to his usual sleeping spot, Mike knew that the coming days would require careful thought and possibly difficult decisions. The inheritance was no longer just about money. It was about identity, family, and long-buried truths. The next morning, Mike woke early, his mind still buzzing with the revelations from the previous day. He made his way to the usual meeting spot where he, Rita, and Tony gathered. As he approached, he saw his friends already there, sharing a thermos of coffee. "Morning, sunshine," Tony called out, his voice gruff but friendly. "You look like you've been wrestling with the weight of the world." Rita scooted over, making room for Mike on the bench. "Everything okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Mike sat down heavily, accepting the chipped mug of coffee Tony offered. "I found out some things yesterday," he began, his voice low. "About my grandfather, the inheritance, and possibly another relative." Rita and Tony exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. "Another relative?" Rita prompted gently. Mike nodded, taking a sip of the strong, bitter coffee before continuing. "I think my grandfather had a child, outside of his marriage. There might be an aunt or uncle I never knew about." Tony let out a low whistle. "Man, your family tree's got more twists than a pretzel factory." Despite the gravity of the situation, Mike couldn't help but chuckle at Tony's comment. It felt good to share his discoveries with people he trusted, people who had no stake in the outcome, beyond genuine concern for his well-being. "So, what are you thinking of doing?" Rita asked, her eyes searching Mike's face. Mike sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I don't know. Part of me wants to find this person, to reach out. They might not even know about their connection to my family. But another part..." He trailed off, his brow furrowed. "Another part is scared of what you might find?" Tony finished for him, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. Mike nodded. "Yeah, and not just that. I'm worried about how it might affect the inheritance, about what Sarah and David might do if they found out." Rita leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Mike, honey, you've got a big heart. That's one of the things we love about you. But you've got to think about yourself too. This inheritance, it could change your life." Tony nodded in agreement. Rita's right, but at the same time, if it were me, I'd want to know if I had family out there. Especially family that might be in the same boat as us. Mike looked between his two friends, feeling a surge of gratitude for their support and wisdom. "You're both right," he said. "I can't ignore this. Whatever I decide about the inheritance, I think I need to at least try to find this person." Rita reached out, squeezing Mike's hand. "Whatever you decide, we've got your back. You know that, right?" Mike nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. Here, among the hardships of street life, he had found a loyalty and support that seemed to be lacking in his newfound family. As they sat there, sharing the last of the coffee and discussing potential ways to track down the unknown relative, Mike felt a renewed sense of purpose. The inheritance was still a looming question, but now he had a more immediate goal: to uncover the truth about his family and potentially connect with someone who might be as lost and alone as he had been. The morning wore on, and eventually they had to part ways to handle their daily struggles for survival. But as Mike set out, his steps felt lighter. He had a mission now, something beyond the day-to-day fight to exist. As he walked, Mike's mind raced with possibilities. Who was this unknown relative? Were they struggling like him, or had they found a different path in life? And how would they react to learning about their connection to the Thompson family? These questions drove Mike forward, giving him a renewed energy. He decided to return to the library, hoping to find more clues in the records he had discovered. As he walked, he realized that this search wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about understanding his past, his family, and perhaps finding a new connection in a world that had often felt cold and indifferent. The streets of New York, usually a maze of survival challenges, now seemed full of possibility. Every face he passed could be the one he was looking for. Every corner could hold a clue to his family's past. As he neared the library, Mike paused, taking a deep breath. He knew that whatever he discovered, it would change things. But with the support of Rita and Tony, and the strength he'd gained from years of facing adversity, he felt ready to face whatever truths he might uncover. With determination in his step, Mike entered the library, ready to delve deeper into the mystery of his family's past and the potential future that awaited him. After days of painstaking research and following leads, Mike finally had a breakthrough. He discovered that the woman mentioned in his grandfather's letters, Elizabeth, had given birth to a daughter named Emily. Armed with this information and a last known address from decades ago, Mike set out to find her. The address led him to a modest neighborhood in Queens, far from the glitz of Manhattan. As Mike approached the worn apartment building, he felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He double-checked the scrap of paper with the address, took a deep breath, and pressed the buzzer for apartment 3B. After a moment of silence, a woman's voice crackled through the intercom. "Who is it?" Mike hesitated for a second before responding. "My name is Mike Thompson. I'm looking for Emily. I think we might be related." There was a long pause, and Mike feared she might not respond. Then, the door buzzed open. Mike climbed the stairs, his heart pounding with each step. When he reached the third floor, he saw a woman in her 50s standing in the doorway of 3B, her expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Emily?" Mike asked tentatively. She nodded, studying him closely. "You said we might be related. How?" Mike explained his situation, telling her about the inheritance, the letters he'd found, and his grandfather Harold. As he spoke, he saw Emily's expression change from skepticism to shock. "I always wondered about my father," Emily said softly, inviting Mike inside. "My mother never told me much about him." As they sat in Emily's small, cluttered living room, Mike couldn't help but notice signs of financial struggle similar to his own. Past due bills on the coffee table, worn furniture, a general air of making do with less. It was clear that if Emily was indeed his aunt, she hadn't benefited from Harold's wealth either. They spent hours talking, sharing stories and piecing together their family history. Emily showed Mike old photos of her mother, and Mike was struck by the resemblance to the woman in the letters he'd found. As their conversation progressed, Mike felt a growing connection to Emily. Despite the circumstances of her birth, she spoke of Harold, or rather the idea of him, with a mixture of curiosity and longing that Mike understood all too well. "I never knew him," Emily said, her voice tinged with regret. "But I always felt like there was a part of my story missing. And now—" She trailed off, looking at Mike with wonder. Mike nodded, understanding the weight of their discovery. "I know what you mean. I've been alone for so long, thinking I had no family left. And now, suddenly, there's you." As evening approached, Mike realized he had to leave. The shelters would be filling up soon, and he needed to secure a place for the night. When he explained this to Emily, her face fell. "You're living on the streets?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Mike, why didn't you say something earlier? You can stay here." Mike hesitated, touched by the offer, but wary of imposing. "I couldn't. We've just met, and you're struggling too. I can see that." Emily shook her head firmly. "We're family. It might be new and it might be complicated, but we're family. I have a couch. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it." As Mike considered her offer, he felt torn. On one hand, the prospect of a safe place to sleep was incredibly tempting. On the other, he thought of Rita and Tony, his chosen family on the streets. He'd grown to rely on them, to trust them in a way he hadn't trusted anyone in years. I need to think about it," Mike said finally. "There are people, friends, I need to talk to first." Emily nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. The offer stands whenever you're ready." As Mike left Emily's apartment, his mind was reeling. He had come seeking answers about his family's past and had found not only those, but a potential new future as well. The connection he felt with Emily was undeniable, a blood tie that spoke to something deep within him. Yet, as he made his way back to his usual haunts, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Emily's offer would mean leaving behind the life he'd known, for better or worse. Rita and Tony had been his rock, his constant in a world of uncertainty. Could he simply walk away from that? As night fell over the city, Mike found himself at a crossroads. The inheritance, once a simple question of accepting or rejecting a sum of money, had become a complex web of relationships, loyalties, and potential futures. Emily represented a chance at family and stability, but accepting it meant potentially leaving behind the only real friends he'd known in years. With these thoughts swirling in his mind, Mike headed towards the spot where he usually met Rita and Tony, knowing he had a lot to share and even more to consider. The city lights flickered around him, a fitting backdrop to the flickering possibilities that now lay before him. The next morning, Mike woke early, his mind still processing the events of the previous day. He had spent a restless night on his usual park bench, the comfort of Emily's couch offer weighing heavily on his mind. As he made his way to meet Rita and Tony, he spotted two familiar figures approaching from the opposite direction, Sarah and David. "Mike, we've been looking all over for you," Sarah called out, her heels clicking rapidly on the pavement as she hurried towards him. David followed close behind, his artistic dishevelment a stark contrast to Sarah's polished appearance. Mike tensed, immediately on guard. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice wary. Sarah produced a folder from her sleek briefcase. "We've got the paperwork ready for you to sign," she explained, her tone businesslike, but with an undercurrent of urgency. It's important we get this done quickly to secure the inheritance." David nodded in agreement, an unusual show of unity between the two. "We've worked out a plan that will benefit everyone," he added, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "With my artistic vision and Sarah's business acumen, we can turn this inheritance into something truly spectacular." Mike took a step back, overwhelmed by their sudden appearance and insistence. "I haven't agreed to anything yet," he said firmly, "and I've got some new information that might change things." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "New information? What do you mean?" Before Mike could respond, he heard familiar voices calling his name. Rita and Tony were approaching, their faces etched with concern as they took in the scene before them. "Everything okay here, Mike?" Tony asked, his stance protective, as he eyed Sarah and David suspiciously. Mike felt a surge of gratitude for his friend's timely arrival. "Yeah, just discussing some family business," he replied, emphasizing the word family as he looked at Rita and Tony. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she assessed the newcomers. "And who might you be?" she asked, her tone barely concealing her disdain. "We're Mike's family," Rita responded firmly, moving to stand beside Mike. "The family he chose." The tension in the air was palpable as the two groups faced off. Mike found himself at the center, physically and metaphorically, of a clash between his past and his present, his blood ties and his chosen bonds. David, sensing the hostility, tried to diffuse the situation. "Look, we're all here for Mike's benefit, right? Let's just talk this through." But Mike had had enough. The pressure from Sarah and David, combined with his recent discoveries and the steadfast support of Rita and Tony, crystallized something in his mind. "No," he said, his voice stronger than he expected. "I'm not signing anything today. I need time to think, to consider all my options." Sarah's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Mike, you don't understand the urgency here. There are time constraints, legal issues." "I understand plenty," Mike interrupted. "I understand that you two showed up out of nowhere when you heard about the money. I understand that you're pushing me to make decisions without knowing the full story." David started to protest, but Mike held up a hand to stop him. "I found out some things about our family, about grandfather, things that might change how this inheritance is distributed." Sarah and David exchanged a worried glance. "What things?" David asked cautiously. Mike shook his head. "I'm not ready to discuss that yet, but I will say this. I'm not making any decisions until I've had time to process everything and consider all my options." The determination in Mike's voice seemed to take Sarah and David aback. They looked at each other, then back at Mike, realizing that their carefully laid plans were unraveling. "Mike, be reasonable," Sarah began, but Tony cut her off. "I think he's being plenty reasonable," Tony growled. "Now, if you don't mind, we've got plans for the day." With that, Rita and Tony flanked Mike, creating a united front against Sarah and David. The message was clear. Mike wasn't alone, and he wouldn't be pushed into anything. Realizing they were fighting a losing battle, Sarah and David reluctantly retreated, but not before Sarah pressed her business card into Mike's hand once more. "Think about what we said, Mike. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." As Sarah and David walked away, Mike felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He turned to Rita and Tony, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thanks, guys. I don't know what I'd do without you." Rita squeezed his arm gently. "That's what family does, Mike. We look out for each other." As they walked away together, Mike felt a renewed sense of clarity. The inheritance, with all its complications, was still a looming issue, but he knew now that whatever decision he made, it would be on his terms, with the support of those who truly cared about him. The day stretched ahead, full of possibilities and challenges. But for now, surrounded by his chosen family, Mike felt ready to face whatever came next. The following day, Mike decided it was time to bring everyone together, He had spent the night thinking about his situation, about Emily, Sarah, David, and his friends on the street. He realized that the only way to move forward was to confront the situation head-on, with all parties involved. Mike reached out to Emily first, explaining his plan. She agreed to host the meeting at her apartment, providing a neutral ground for what promised to be a tense gathering. Next, he contacted Sarah and David, who were surprised but eager to attend, likely hoping to sway Mike's decision in their favor. As the appointed time approached, Mike, Rita, and Tony made their way to Emily's apartment. Mike could feel the nervous energy radiating from his friends, who had never been in a situation quite like this before. "You sure about this, Mike?" Tony asked as they climbed the stairs to Emily's floor. "Mixing your street family with your blood family. It could get messy." Mike nodded, his jaw set with determination. "It's the only way to sort this out. Everyone needs to understand the full picture." When they entered Emily's apartment, they found Sarah and David already there, looking uncomfortable in the modest surroundings. Emily bustled about, trying to make everyone feel welcome despite the palpable tension in the air. As everyone settled into seats around Emily's small living room, Mike took a deep breath and began to speak. "I know this is an unusual situation," he started, looking around at the diverse group gathered before him. "But I think it's important that we're all here together. There's a lot at stake, and everyone in this room is affected by what happens next." Mike went on to explain the full story: his discovery of Emily, the revelations about his grandfather's past, and the complicated nature of the inheritance. As he spoke, he could see the shock and surprise on Sarah and David's faces. "So you see," Mike concluded, "this isn't just about me accepting an inheritance. It's about family. Both the family I never knew I had," he nodded towards Emily, "and the family I chose." He smiled at Rita and Tony. Sarah was the first to break the stunned silence that followed. "This changes everything," she said, her business-like demeanor faltering. "If Emily is indeed Harold's daughter, she has a legal claim to part of the inheritance." David nodded in agreement, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I had no idea. Grandfather always seemed so straight-laced. To think he had a whole other family." Emily spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not here to claim anything. I just wanted to know my history, to understand where I came from. The money, it's not important to me." "Maybe not to you," Tony interjected, his voice gruff. "But it could make a real difference to Mike, to all of us living on the streets." Sarah's eyes narrowed at this. "And what exactly is your stake in this?" she asked Tony, her tone sharp. Rita bristled at Sarah's tone. "Our stake is Mike's well-being," she retorted, "something you seem to have forgotten in your rush to get your hands on the money." The room erupted into heated discussion, with everyone talking over each other. Mike watched as his two worlds collided, the polished facade of Sarah and David clashing with the raw honesty of Rita and Tony, while Emily sat quietly, looking overwhelmed by the family drama she had suddenly found herself in the middle of. As the arguments escalated, Mike suddenly stood up, silencing the room. "Enough," he said firmly. "This is exactly why I brought you all together. We need to figure this out, not fight among ourselves." He turned to Sarah and David. "You two have been so focused on how to use the inheritance that you've forgotten about the person it was left to, me, and about the family secrets it's uncovered." Then he addressed Rita and Tony. "And you guys, I appreciate your support more than you know. But this is my decision to make, and I need to consider all angles." Finally, he looked at Emily. "You're part of this too, whether you want to be or not. We're family, and that means something." Mike's words seemed to have an impact on everyone in the room. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. "So what do you want to do, Mike?" Emily asked gently. Mike took a deep breath. I think we need to use this inheritance to help people. Not just me, not just us in this room, but people who are struggling, like I've been struggling. Maybe we can set up a foundation or fund programs for the homeless." Sarah's eyes lit up at this. A foundation. That could work. We could structure it in a way that provides for you, Mike, while also doing good for others. David nodded enthusiastically. And we could incorporate art programs, ways for people to express themselves and heal through creativity. As the conversation shifted from arguing to brainstorming, Mike felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since he'd received the news of his inheritance, he felt like he was on the right path. The meeting continued late into the night, with ideas flowing and connections forming between the unlikely group. As Mike looked around at the faces of his old friends and new family, he realized that the true inheritance wasn't just the money. It was the chance to bring people together, to make a difference in a way he never thought possible. As the meeting wound down and people began to leave, Mike felt a sense of hope he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't facing it alone. In the days following the meeting, Mike found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The idea of using the inheritance to create a foundation had taken root, and everyone was eager to contribute their skills and ideas to make it a reality. Sarah, true to her marketing background, took charge of developing a business plan for the foundation. She spent hours with Mike, explaining the intricacies of nonprofit organizations and how they could structure the foundation to have the most impact. "We'll need to set up a board of directors," Sarah explained, her usual business-like demeanor softened by genuine enthusiasm. "I'm thinking you should be the chairman, Mike. It's your vision driving this after all." Mike nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the scale of what they were undertaking. "And the others? I want everyone involved in this." Sarah smiled, surprising Mike with her understanding. "Of course, we'll find roles for everyone. Emily's experience with struggling financially will be invaluable in identifying the right programs to support. And your friends, Rita and Tony, they have firsthand knowledge of life on the streets. That's priceless for what we're trying to do." Meanwhile, David had thrown himself into brainstorming creative programs that the foundation could support. He envisioned art therapy sessions for homeless individuals, public art projects to beautify neglected neighborhoods, and workshops to teach marketable creative skills. "Art saved my life, Mike," David confided during one of their planning sessions. "It gave me purpose when I felt lost. I want to offer that same lifeline to others." Emily, despite her initial hesitation, had become an integral part of the team. Her quiet strength and practical nature helped ground some of the more ambitious ideas, ensuring that the foundation's efforts would truly help those in need. Rita and Tony, initially skeptical of working with Mike's uptown relatives, had slowly warmed to the idea. They spent time canvassing their network of homeless friends, gathering ideas, and identifying the most pressing needs. "You wouldn't believe how excited people are, Mike," Rita reported one evening. "Just the idea that someone wants to help, really help, not just throw some spare change our way. It's giving people hope." As the plans for the foundation took shape, Mike found himself facing a crucial decision. Sarah and the lawyer handling the inheritance had made it clear. To effectively run the foundation, Mike would need to leave the streets. "You can't lead this effort from a park bench, Mike," Sarah said gently. "You need a permanent address, a place to work from, a way to meet with potential donors and partners." The prospect of leaving behind the life he had known for so long filled Mike with a mix of excitement and trepidation. He thought of the countless nights spent huddled for warmth, the daily struggle for food and safety. But he also thought of the bonds he had formed, the community he had become a part of. One evening, as he sat with Rita and Tony in their usual spot, Mike broached the subject. I think it's time for me to find a place," he said hesitantly. "To really commit to making this foundation work." He had expected resistance, maybe even anger. Instead, he was met with understanding smiles. "We knew this was coming, Mike," Tony said, his gruff voice tinged with emotion. "You've got a chance to do something big here, something that could help a lot of people like us." Rita nodded in agreement. "We're proud of you, Mike, and don't worry about us. We'll be right here, helping you make this foundation the best it can be." Their support meant everything to Mike. It affirmed that in pursuing this new path, he wasn't abandoning his chosen family, but rather expanding it, creating a broader network of support and care. As the day approached for Mike to sign the final papers and officially accept the inheritance, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. The inheritance, which had initially seemed like a complication in his life, had become a catalyst for change, not just for him, but for an entire community. Standing outside the lawyer's office, Mike took a deep breath. He thought of Emily, finally knowing her place in the family. He thought of Sarah and David, channeling their skills into something meaningful. He thought of Rita and Tony, and all the others like them who would benefit from what they were about to create. With a sense of determination, Mike pushed open the door. As he prepared to sign the papers that would set this new chapter of his life in motion, he realized that the true inheritance he had received wasn't just money. It was the opportunity to make a difference, to bring people together, and to create a legacy of compassion and change. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he leaned over the documents. With each signature, Mike felt like he was not just accepting an inheritance, but embracing a new identity, one that bridged the worlds he had known and opened up possibilities he had never dared to imagine. As Mike signed the final document, a palpable sense of change filled the room. The lawyer, a kindly, older gentleman named Mr. Goldstein, smiled warmly as he gathered the papers. "Congratulations, Mr. Thompson," he said, extending his hand. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you're doing with his legacy." Mike shook the lawyer's hand, feeling a mix of emotions wash over him. As he turned to leave the office, he was surprised to see Sarah, David, Emily, Rita, and Tony all waiting for him in the hallway. Their presence, a united front of his past and present, touched him deeply. "We couldn't let you do this alone," Emily said softly, giving him a quick hug. As they left the building together, Mike felt a need to share something that had been weighing on his mind. He led them to a nearby park, where they all settled on benches surrounding a small fountain. "There's something I need to tell you all," Mike began, his voice serious. "When I was going through my grandfather's things, I found more than just the letters about Emily." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a weathered envelope. This was tucked away in an old journal. It's addressed to his future heir, to me. With trembling hands, Mike opened the envelope and began to read aloud. "To my heir, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've inherited not just my wealth, but the weight of our family's history. I've lived a life filled with success, but also with regrets. The greatest of these was my failure to acknowledge all of my family, to right the wrongs of the past. I was a man of my time, bound by societal expectations and my own fears. I let those fears dictate my actions, separating me from those I should have held closest. Emily, if you ever learn of this letter, know that you were loved, even if I lacked the courage to show it. To whoever now bears the Thompson name and fortune, I leave you with this plea. Learn from my mistakes. Wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. Use what I've left you to heal the rifts I've created, to bring together what I've torn apart. There's more to our family's story than what's written in official records. Seek out those who have been forgotten or cast aside. In them, you may find the truest meaning of family. Remember, it's never too late to right a wrong, to extend a hand in friendship and love. This is the true legacy I hope to leave behind. With hope for the future, Harold Thompson. As Mike finished reading, a heavy silence fell over the group. Tears glistened in Emily's eyes, and even Sarah and David looked deeply moved. "He knew," Emily whispered. "All this time, he knew about me." Tony, his usual gruffness softened by emotion, spoke up. "Seems like your grandpa was carrying a heavy load, but he was trying to make it right in the end." Sarah nodded, her business-like demeanor completely gone. "This changes everything. The foundation. It's not just about helping the homeless. It's about bringing people together, isn't it? About family, in the broadest sense." David, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "I always thought Grandfather was this stern, unyielding man. But this shows a whole other side of him. A side that wanted to make amends." Mike looked around at the group, seeing the impact of his grandfather's words on each of them. "I think this is what he really left us. Not just money, but a chance to do better, to be better." Rita reached out and squeezed Mike's hand. "And that's exactly what we're going to do, right?" Mike nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation will be about more than just providing shelter or food. It'll be about creating connections, about showing people that family isn't just about blood. It's about who we choose to stand by, who we choose to help. As they sat there, the newly formed family began to plan. They talked about programs that would not only assist those in need, but also bring communities together. They discussed ways to honor Harold's wish to seek out and support forgotten family members. The sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park. Mike looked at the faces around him, Sarah's determination, David's creative spark, Emily's quiet strength, Rita's compassion, and Tony's steadfast loyalty. He realized that this diverse group, brought together by chance and choice, was the embodiment of what his grandfather had hoped for. As they stood to leave, each heading to their respective homes, Mike to his new apartment, Rita and Tony to their shelter, Sarah and David to their city residences, and Emily to her modest flat. There was a sense of unity and purpose that hadn't existed before. Mike knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges in running the foundation, in navigating their new family dynamics, in bridging the worlds they came from. But he also knew that together, they had the strength to face whatever came their way. As he walked towards his new home, Mike felt the weight of the letter in his pocket. It wasn't a burden, but a reminder of the legacy he was now part of. A legacy not of wealth, but of redemption, of second chances, and of the enduring power of family, both given and chosen. The city lights flickered on around him, and for the first time in years, Mike felt truly at home. He had found his place, not just in a physical sense, but in the web of connections that now surrounded him. As he looked up at the sky, barely visible through the city's glow, he whispered a quiet thank you to his grandfather for the gift that went far beyond money, the gift of purpose, of family, and of hope.